Welcome back to the Piping Pastor Theology Talks. Today we'll be discussing, as I mentioned in the introductory video, creationism, or more specifically, theological cosmologies. Well, good afternoon. It's lovely to be back with you. I had the opportunity to do some traveling recently. I was offering a series of classes on existential truths, and then a follow-up talk on prophecy in Isaiah. So it's lovely to be back here. Now, today, as I mentioned, I would tackle the rather controversial issue of creationism, creation theology, or as I said, theological cosmologies. During this talk, I'm smoking some Three Nuns tobacco, which I've discussed in another video, which is a lovely blend I was actually rather surprised by. And I will say, pairs beautifully with a warm apple cider. Now, when it comes to the idea of cosmology essentially is the scientific study of the origins of the universe. So when I refer to what many people call creation theology as a theological cosmology, there's a specific purpose behind it, that being that science and theology do not have to be disparate things. Historically, in recent history, in the last few hundred years, I would say, they really have been antithetical. And a lot of people view them as non-overlapping magisteria, essentially, that theology deals with this over here and science deals with this over here. However, both seek truth. Science deals with the measurable aspects of reality and therefore the penultimate truths. Theology deals with the ontological impetus for all of creation. So the big truth. But you can't get to the big truth without going through the little truths, because God is a God of order. I mentioned that in the Poetry in the Bible video I did most recently. God is not a God of disorder and chaos. Therefore, the universe has an order that reveals who God is. Now, interpreting how that universe began is where we hit a great deal of controversy, especially in the evangelical community. Do my best to keep this lit. Now, prior to the late 1700s, the overall thinking was that the Earth is about 6,000 years old. That was a popular interpretation based on math. Theologians essentially added up all of the years that were depicted in the Bible for various different things. So many generations, so many people, so many lives going back and back and back. And they, did the math and figured out about 6,000. Now, the reason that was mathematically deduced and accepted is because at that time, one could not study theology until one had studied everything else. Theology was referred to as the queen of the sciences. You could not be trusted with sacred knowledge at the highest levels until you had mastered all of the mundane things of learning. So mathematics, astronomy, literature, languages, and so on and so forth. So if someone was studying theology, then they had already studied all those other things, and therefore they were considered an academic expert. So these theologians took those years, added them up, and came up with 6,000 years old. Then along comes Darwin. Doing scientific research of a different nature, which seemed to indicate that species had changed over the course of many, many, many years. And it seemed to indicate that if evolution were true, if species did evolve over time, then there was a lot of time that was needed, right? 6,000 years wouldn't cut it. If you have a turtle who has an altered shell so it can reach higher leaves, it takes generations and generations and generations for that mutation to take hold. So there was a bit of a controversy there. The theory in itself caused a lot of controversy, but the fact that the timing of it, the time needed was not sustainable. But then along comes James Hutton, a Scottish geologist, and it's Hutton who we have to thank for the concept of deep time. Hutton didn't coin the phrase deep time; that phrase wasn't used until 200 years later. But he was the first one who, in observing layers of rock formations on the coast in Scotland, a place I've happily been able to visit, figured out that, hey, you know what? These rock formations could not have happened this way in the way that they obviously have by just simply looking at them if the Earth was 6,000 years old. We're talking millions, billions of years in order for these sediments to form, these different rock layers to be formed in the way they were. Because he saw there was a break, and then there's a whole other discussion about that. Suffice it to say, his research, which was demonstrably, obviously true to everyone once it was published, indicated that the Earth was very, very old. That in and of itself may not necessarily have thrown all the theologians into a scramble, but it did pair with Darwin's work, which suggest that the story in Genesis 1 and 2 was not a literal account. So here we have young Earth creationism versus a more scientific cosmology of the universe. And they seem to be at odds. The scientific work seemed to indicate that if indeed the Earth was billions of years old, not thousands of years old, if evolution was true, then humans were also the product of evolution, which not only negated the literal interpretation of Genesis 1 and 2, it also seemed to call into question the special nature of humanity being created in the image of God. These were all theological tenets which people had taken as given, and they're now being called into question by scientific discovery. This is still something we're dealing with today, several hundred years later. With the discovery of cosmic background radiation, they've been able to deduce that the universe began 13.6 billion years ago. I think that's the number right around there, give or take a million. Which again just lends more credence to the idea of old Earth, of long-term creation, and the biggest sticking point, evolutions of humans. Which caused a great many people to really dig in their heels on the idea of a young Earth. In the face of all the scientific discovery and evidence and so on and so forth, they looked for any kind of argument against that. Any credible scientist who would say, no, there's a question here. There will always be questions in scientific research. But can we reconcile the idea that, say you're a scientifically minded person, you're a scientist yourself, can you still be a Christian and be a scientist who believes in the dating of cosmic background radiation, who believes in the concept of deep time, and still believe in God? Short answer, yes. You see, Believing in a literal interpretation of Genesis 1 and 2 is not a prerequisite to coming to the saving notion of Jesus Christ. Genesis 1 and 2, when you look at it, and I won't get into the entire discussion here about the formation of Hebrew poetry and so on and so forth, contextual and literary criticism and so on and so forth. Suffice it to say, the point of Genesis 1 and 2 is not to give humans a step-by-step instruction book on how the universe was created. If that were God's intent, and God were to give us a step-by-step instruction manual of how the universe was created, A, why? What point would it serve? It's not as if, we get the stereo instructions, we can put it together, right? B, the idea, those concepts are so far above our human understanding. There's a reason the Bible says that God's ways are above our ways, God's knowledge is above our knowledge. We can't even truly conceive of absolute nothingness. I can say the words, but we can't really conceptually wrap our mind around that. Even quantum vacuums have microparticles that quarks that bebop around in there. So when it comes to absolute nothingness, there's nothing in our reality that equals absolute nothingness. And if you look at the concept of creation ex nihilo, creation out of nothing, it starts with absolute nothingness. On top of that, matter, physical matter, comes out of nothingness. How is that possible, right? It's not possible for us to explain it, because if we could explain it, we could do it. If I can explain to you how to make a crepe, then that means I probably know how to make a crepe, or at the very least understand all the steps involved in it to the point where I can show someone else how to do it. And anyway, that crepe is going to get made either by myself or the person I'm teaching, right? God was not trying to impart knowledge to us so we could go create a universe, right? The point of Genesis 1 and 2 is to demonstrate to us who God is, who we are, and who we are in relationship to God. God is the creator. God is the Alpha. God is the Omega. God is the one who put the entire universe together in an orderly fashion to demonstrate God's sovereignty, to demonstrate God's grandeur, to demonstrate God's love and creativity, and all these other things that God is. We don't need to look at it as a science text. That's not how it was written. That's not why it was written. It has nothing to do with your personal salvation. God created the universe 6,000 years ago, or God created the universe 13.6 billion years ago, makes no difference when it comes to the saving knowledge of Jesus Christ. So yes, you can believe in old earth. You don't have to follow the young earth creationism to be a quote-unquote true Christian. Okay, it's not a litmus test, right? We can believe in science. We can believe in scientific truths that point us to the ultimate metaphysical truth that is the grounding of all the scientific truths. So that is it for this discussion. Now, if there's any questions, of course, by all means, put them in the comments. I'm happy to have a little back and forth. None of us are as smart as all of us. And next time, we will be led into another area, and I will touch on human evolution, or more to the point, theological anthropology, and the progression of humans through history. Because that is the other thing that comes up when you talk about the age of the universe and old earth creationism. Well, did humans come from apes? We'll get into that in another video. So, until that time, as always, happy reading.